Welcome everybody. As you're settling in, relax. We'll be starting soon. As per usual on CIPS webinars, make sure you go to the chat button and select all panelists and attendees and tell us where you're from today. We normally get people from all over our region and further afar, so please tell us where you're from. Grab the chat button and select all panelists and all attendees and let us know where you're from. I'm from Melbourne today and you've come to the right place. We're going to be hearing on the CIPS ACT branch webinar, the topic from cladding to chemicals. What role can procurement play in risk mitigation in the public sector? So sit back, relax, and we'll be starting shortly. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the CIPS ACT branch webinar on the topic from cladding to chemicals, what role can procurement play in risk mitigation in the public sector? We're in for a ripper today. We have over 100 registered attendees, and that's people, as I've said, from all over the region. So great, keep using the chat button and letting us know where you're from. I'm delighted to be welcoming you all and representing the professional body as General Manager for CIPS Australia and New Zealand. To all attendees, a very warm welcome. And in particular, we're really delighted to be able to connect with government and public sector procurement professionals at this extraordinary time, an unparalleled time really. And we know that you're all facing disruption and stress caused by this corona outbreak. So we really appreciate your willingness to join us for this virtual event. Firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I present today. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples today. And Tēnā kōkō, tēnā kōkō, tēnā kōkō katoa. For those of you who don't know us, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, or CIPS, is your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals. And we're absolutely dedicated to promoting best practice, continuous improvement in professional standards, and raising the awareness of the contribution that procurement and supply management can make to organisations, but also to the community at large. With over 70,000 globally, we are also the world's largest provider of specialist training in all aspects of procurement and supply. And we take seriously our mandate to act in the public interest and on the behalf and the benefit of the procurement professionals of a whole. We act as a voice for the profession. Our role is also to help our members become better professionals, to support organisations to improve their procurement practices, and we're really proud to be the global body of knowledge for procurement and supply. We set the global standard, a competency framework for the profession. And in the current environment, it's never been so important to feel connected. So our virtual connections have never been so critical. I believe it's our role as your professional body to amplify that connectedness and support procurement professionals at this time. And now I'd like to hand over to the CIPS ACT branch chair, Jane Wagner, who's our host and today's webinar moderator. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Sharon, and welcome everybody. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping notices that I'd like to advise everybody. This webinar is currently being recorded and will be made available to all members the following week. All attendees have been muted during the presentation. However, we do ask that you utilise the Q&A box to write any questions you might have for our panellists, and we look forward to answering as many of your questions during the Q&A session at the end. You also have the chat button, which some of you have already used. It's fantastic to see lots of people from Canberra and around Australia and indeed around the region and the world. It's really fantastic that you've engaged with this topic. So please have a chat and utilise that for general comments that you'd like to share with the attendees. We're going to do a couple of poll questions during the webinar, so please participate. We really want to hear your views. As I was preparing for today's webinar, I started reflecting on my own procurement experience and how procurements that I've been involved with assessed risk. One of the key procurements where I chaired the evaluation panel was for the $20 million Cocos Keeling Island runway project. That's a bit of a mouthful. Cocos Keeling Island is approximately 3,000 kilometres from Perth in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The risks weren't just about the procurement. I think we've all been involved in procurements where only risk might be that perhaps no one will tender, or perhaps too many will tender, or perhaps the price won't be within our budget. But this particular project took risks, identification and mitigation of those risks to a whole different level. There were stakeholder risks. The local Malay community who lived on the airport perimeter when the construction was planned to occur in the middle of the night needed to be consulted. The supply of material risks. All the runway construction material had to come from mainland Australia, every last stone. Transport risks. The material had to be barged across the Indian Ocean in around 400 trips over 6 months. And before that could even happen, the wharf had to be modified to take the barge in the first place. There were construction risks. There had to be transfer of knowledge to the local community in order to, I guess, heavy press the runway design in order to take military grade aircraft. And there were aviation risks. Who's responsible if a plane crashes on a runway? And the tenderers who were not able to adequately address these risks in their tender bids were quickly eliminated from the process. I want to now move to our distinguished expert panelists for today. Firstly, it's a thrill for us that Duncan Brock FCIPS Chartered, who's the Group Customer Relation Director at CIPS UK, has been able to join us. Duncan was due to be in Australia at this time, and we had hoped that he would be here for an actual function, but we've got him for a webinar instead. Duncan's experience is in business development for procurement services with a learning and development and process excellent focus. His main responsibilities are for CIPS in Europe, MENA and Africa, with expansions planned into the US and the Asia Pacific markets. Following the Hackitt review into the Grenfell Tower in 2017, an industry response group was established to focus on improving competencies across various aspects of tall buildings, and Duncan was invited to chair the procurement working group. His knowledge and experience with this is going to be insightful during this webinar. And Luke McLeod, MCIPS, is the Assistant Secretary of PFAS Investigation and Management in the Department of Defence. Luke is leading the branch that delivers a range of policy, communication, community engagement and project delivery outcomes in support of Defence's response to PFAS contamination. Sophia, if you could bring up our first poll question. We thought we'd start with a poll question just to get you all engaged. And this is in context of what I was just talking about in reflecting on my Cocos Keeling Island experience. And what we would like you to consider is, when considering the risks of what your organisation project is trying to achieve in procuring complex goods, projects or services, what role do you consider procurement to have in risk mitigation? Is it a fully responsible role or a lead role? Is there some responsibility or a key stakeholder role? Is there limited responsibility, sometimes or partially involved? No responsibility, not involved, or you're just not sure? If you can answer that question, we'll give you a couple of minutes to think about it and come back with a response. So that's really insightful. So I can see there that a majority of people, 70% of you, consider that there's some responsibility or there's a key stakeholder role in the procurement role in overall projects. So that's really interesting. So I might move to our first panelist, Duncan Brock. Duncan, welcome to Australia at this time. I'm wondering if you might be able to tell us a little bit about your current role.
Yes, Jane, thanks for that. And as you said at the beginning of the introduction, it would have been great to have been with you in person. But in these strange times, I think we're all getting used to doing it on these screens instead. But it's great to be here. My current role at CIPS is focusing on working with organisations on how they improve their procurement capability. And that's whether they're investing in their people, building up their skills and their capability of their people, or also looking at the organisation itself and the way that this procurement works, the structure of it. And the way we work on that is really, running training programs, supporting organisations, and basically looking to build up procurement competence and capability. And I think, as you said in your intro, I'm based in England. We've got a team focusing here on Europe, but we also have teams all over the world, including the one in Australia and New Zealand, helping organisations in those places as well.
So how did you actually get into procurement?
I'm one of those few people who joined straight from university. There's not many of us, are there, who actually sort of said, you know what, this is a career I want in my life. So I'd actually been at a summer job in a buying department in a textile factory, and thought, oh, actually, this is quite fun. So I went to university, studied, and came out, and I was looking for jobs in procurement. And I joined Ford, which was a great first couple of years for me. Went on to work for Mars for a couple of years, and then I had probably my most formative time as a Black & Decker, which is power tool manufacturing. And there I was doing global sourcing. I was doing all sorts of really good forward-looking procurement, and became procurement director. I then had a couple of other CPO jobs, one in insurance, one in telecommunications. I spent 10 years doing consultancy, where I'm really working on driving forward things like category management, supplier management, training and educating teams all over the world again. And then the last 8 years I've been at CIPS. So I've been in my profession, if you like, all the way through, and now I'm working for my institute, which is a great place to be.
It's fantastic. It's almost like you've come the full circle to be, I guess, helping the younger generation to come through the ranks.
Yeah, you always say about sort of giving something back, and I suppose I'm in a great position now where I can, and paid to do so, which is rather than actually volunteering. This is my role, which is great fun.
That's fantastic. So can you tell us a little bit about how you came to your role with the industry response group after the Grenfell Tower inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, for those who, most people have heard about the Grenfell Tower disaster. I mean, it was a terrible night for us in the UK. It was terrible when we saw 72 people dying overnight in a tower block as it went up in an inferno. And off the back of that, there was quite a lot of work that went on to look at what had gone wrong. And the formative piece of inquiry work was done by Dame Judith Hackitt, which was this Hackitt review. She published that. And in that, she focused really quite a lot on competence. And what she was saying was there was a real failings in competence of people, both working on a high-rise building and also, the build-up or the design, the architects, the way the whole building was put together and refurbished. So she was saying, look, you as an industry, as a sector in construction, you need to improve competence. Off the back of that, there was a steering group set up looking at competence. And initially they looked at probably 6 or 7 professions, the core professions you'd expect, like fire and rescue services and builders and architects. But very quickly, as they were having their discussions as working groups, they realized that procurement kept on coming up as an issue. And they realized that actually there was no one really looking at procurement. And they approached CIPS and they said to us, would you chair this working group looking at procurement competence, where it is now and what it needs to be in the future? And I looked around in CIPS and thought, well, no one else is going to do this, so I'll step forward and chair it. And I did that, and I've been running this working group, really looking at how to improve competence levels in construction. I had a great working group. It was like 24 different organisations, which included professional bodies, it included contractors, included central governments, other people with vested interests. You know, it was one of those real hard work, because you've got lots of different people working together, but actually really good to get those different perceptions of procurement and try to understand why it is in this sector, particularly in construction in the UK, that the procurement is just nowhere near where it needs to be.
Yeah. So what were the key procurement issues identified during the inquiry in relation to the Grenfell Tower situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jane, one of the challenges we've still got here is that there's still a public inquiry underway onto the causes of the fire. So there's two parts of that inquiry. The first part, public inquiry, was what happened on the night, and quite a lot of findings about how fire and rescue services reacted, what was involved in reacting on the night of the fire. Phase two of the inquiry is really important to understand how did that tower block get to a situation where it just went up in flames. You know, a small fire in the back of an electrical appliance on the 4th floor flat burnt down a whole tower block and killed 72 people. So that inquiry is still going on. However, I think it's become very, very clear as we've gone through the discussions that construction procurement is in a bad way. I've worked, as I said for my CV, I've worked in all sectors. I've never really dealt with construction before, and I've now started looking at construction. And I've been pretty shocked by the culture of procurement that's in construction. One of the things is clearly there aren't people who are competent in procurement who are doing procurement. It seems to be a sense that everyone can have a go. Whether you're on a project site, or if you're a quantity surveyor, or you're an architect, or you're an advisor, everyone's okay to have a go at procurement. And I think we all know that that's not a great way forward. What happens then is we then get into very much a lowest bid, a low cost culture. And the margins are so low that people cut corners. They cut corners for commercial gain. They look at options for compromising safety. There's a sense of substitution can go on. You know, you can swap something out. You know, a fire door in a building. Oh well, this one's cheaper. I'll go for that one. Well, is it okay? Well, I think so. I mean, that's just not acceptable. You know, you wouldn't do that in a. I worked for Black & Decker. You know, would you take a cheap switch from China and swap it with a high quality one from Germany and just put it in a power tool and hope it works? No, you'd go through rigorous testing and approvals before you'd actually get it approved. But it seems to be that you can, substitutions rife. There's this focus on cash flow is poor, and you've really got to work out how to drive that through and actually change the culture that it's not okay to just keep doing this in this way. We've got to do things in a much more structured way, but actually make sure people really do take a balanced view of decision making on procurement.
Yeah. Before I go to my next question, I just want to do a call out to anybody that if you've got any questions of Duncan as we're going through, please put them in the Q&A box, because we'd love to hear from you. I think that's right, Duncan. Do you think there's probably a view, even in maybe public sector circles when we're doing construction projects, that we'll go and get something a little bit cheaper? In Australia, it might be cheaper. You know, there's examples of maybe buying cheap Australian steel to build a stadium, for example, and then the stadium falls down. Do you think that's really driven by price rather than actually taking it to the next level, which is around value for money?
Absolutely. I think, and when things are tight, and we're just look at where we are now. We're all in a recession, aren't we? You know, we budgets will be squeezed all over the place, and my concern is that in that environment, this will continue. That, you know, the budget holders say, well, it would have cost you $1 million to do that. Can you do it for $700,000? And someone goes, yeah, and submits a bid for that, and then they spend all their time trying to make money on $700,000, even though they should have gone for $1 million. So that sense of yes, looking for lowest price because money is tight. we all understand. However, and this is really however, that's because people who are doing that procurement have only ever, most of them have been in construction all their lives. I mean, I've met a lot of people who, you know, I've been in procurement all my life, but these are people who are ingrained in, well, this is how construction is. This is how we do things. And therefore they just carry on doing it because they don't know what good looks like. They haven't seen how to do things on a total value position, or taking a lifetime cost approach rather than just the cost of doing the building or the refurbishment at that point in time. That's where most other sectors have moved to. And there's just something that's not quite right about the construction sector. And maybe it's the people who lead the organisations, it's people who run the contractors, who've never actually seen what really good procurement looks like and how to do things on a value basis and to get the real successes from that. And I'm really keen that as we find successful construction projects, as we find organisations who are doing it well, that we promote what they're doing and why and the success from it, to show to others that it can be done differently. And that's just not in the UK. I mean, I've spent time talking about this in either many webinars or conferences, and people keep coming up to me and saying, well, it's not just an English or UK problem, we have the problem here as well. And so we've really got to try and find ways of changing that.
There's just a question that's come in that kind of leads on from there. We've got a lot of focus, I guess, coming out of COVID-19 on infrastructure projects. Certainly in Australia we do, where they're bringing infrastructure projects forward. Do you think there's going to be a bit of pressure there to cut corners and also not observe, some of the standards that we should be applying, and making sure that these projects are, to the standard that the community would require of us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure most governments at the moment are looking for ways to stimulate their economies, and they're looking to put money into construction. It's Boris Johnson in the UK came out with this great phrase of build, build, build. It's like this is going to be the answer to all of our problems. But absolutely, that sort of stimulating the economy through construction is going to be there. But then at the same time, they can't throw a huge amount of money at it. But there are ways in which construction can be done cost effectively and for organisations to make money as they're going along. And I think that's the key here, Jane, is that it isn't good enough to just say squeeze the price. It's actually understand that the people in the supply chain need to make money. And if they make money, they'll actually do a good job. And so how do you make sure that you're working together on the design, that you're doing it collaboratively, that you're not just throwing it over the wall and hoping it sticks? You're doing things in a way that allows you to really focus on value and the total value. And I'll use Grenfell Tower as an example here. One of the things that came through was that there was a disregard for resident safety. So huge amount of focus in construction on health and safety of the people who are building the buildings. And I think most countries have done a really good job in protecting the workers, but have they really focused on the residents' safety? And the head of the Construction Industry Council in the UK, who was running our competence group, actually quoted that a number of times in conferences, that finally the sector is starting to take the residents' safety as seriously as those who are building it. And maybe that's the lens that people need to keep having on this, that it's not just cutting corners, that actually, you have a wall fall down, you have a school roof that falls off, you have a bridge that collapses in Italy, wherever it would be, you are affecting people's lives. And that's the thing that we need to just keep reminding people of, that these projects are big projects, but they're also the potential danger to lives if things aren't done well is one of the things that we just got to keep that lens. And Grenfell Tower was a disaster. It was a terrible disaster. When I still go back past the tower block, you still sort of have that shudder of, did this really happen? But using that lens to keep the focus on it, I think is one of the things that we can all do, because that will remind people that, these things should not be happening in today's environment.
Yeah. Thanks for that terrific introduction, Duncan. I might move now to our second poll question. Sophia, if you could bring that up for us. And this is when undertaking procurement, are broader risks considered beyond the procurement process and contract management risks? So we have always, mostly, sometimes, rarely, or not sure. I'm wondering if you're listening in, please let us know your views, because we'd love to hear them. So I'll just give you a couple minutes to, or a couple seconds really, to think about that. And we'll bring up the results. There we go. Sometimes and only by procurement, 41%, mostly 32%, and always 18%. I mean, over 50% looks like it's broader risks are considered, which is really good news. I'm going to move to our next speaker now, who's Luke McLeod. Hello, Luke, and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for making the time to join us.
Hi, Jane. Good afternoon, everyone.
I'm just wondering if you might be able to tell us a little bit about your current role, because it's quite different to Duncan's.
Yes, it is different, Jane. So my role, I run the Department of Defence's National PFAS investigation program. So we've been doing environmental investigations at 28 individual sites across the country. A contamination issue that's been associated with firefighting practices. PFAS, a family of chemicals, there's about 4,500 of them. They're in a whole bunch of different products, but they were particularly in the firefighting foams that we use principally on our airfields, but also in our structural firefighting. And they're an emerging contaminant, or probably now considered to be a contaminant. Still a lot of uncertainty around the environmental and the possible human health impacts that go along with exposure. So my role has been to run that program nationally, which I've been doing now for close enough to 4 years.
How did you get into, I know you've had a different role to this as well, and you've done a lot of procurement in
Yes,
defence.
sorry, Joe. So I've been in defence for 28 years and have done a number of different roles. The one I've spent most time in has been around the contract of our base services activities. So catering, cleaning, fixed plant and equipment maintenance, project delivery services, waste, those types of things. Probably in contrast to Duncan, I kind of fell into procurement, saw procurement as a good opportunity to, I guess, be involved in change. And I've always looked at procurement as a vehicle for change. There will always be some change at the end of a procurement process. So as when I got promoted into the role that I'm currently in, and I often say to people that I did such a good job in procurement that they gave me this role. And I asked my deputy secretary who promoted me in an area that I have no technical or educational background in, around environmental contamination, sort of what in me did he see as being good for the role? And he talked about that I was good with stakeholders and a good communicator. And I think that's, very much a key core capability of good procurement, is to be able to engage with those who you're assisting procure things, and to be able to engage with industry, to let them know what we're trying to buy and how we want it to work and what sort of partnerships we're looking for. So that's, I guess, how I sort of have gotten into procurement. I professionalised in procurement through doing postgraduate study. I've got an executive master's, which was focused on strategic procurement. And I'm soon to move back into a role where I'll have another, I guess, large procurement process doing base services again.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I tend to agree with you on the communication and stakeholders. I can't believe the number of procurements that I've come across in the public sector that when I guess suppliers put their bids in, they just don't realise the amount of communication and stakeholders that we have to be mindful of in the government sector. you know, from parliamentary committees through to the Australian National Audit Office, for example. We have a range of different stakeholders, just not the ones that you would normally think. So yes, it's a critical role in public sector procurement. Can you tell us a little bit about your role with the PFAS investigation and management branch in Defence?
Yeah, so about 4 or 5 years ago, we started detecting surfactants in groundwater. We do routine monitoring on our estate. We obviously manage a very large estate on behalf of the Australian people, and we're very committed to responsible environmental management. So routine monitoring happens across the estate. Doing some routine monitoring of groundwater, we identified these surfactants. At that time, it was difficult to actually analyse for the different chemicals that we were finding, but you know, there's been a rapid expansion of laboratory capability to actually test for these chemicals at very low concentrations. And it became an issue where it was impacting communities that lived around our bases. PFAS, I guess, associated with firefighting foam, they will essentially move very quickly with water and they will blanket a fire and starve it of oxygen. But they're very persistent chemicals. They don't biodegrade. So what we were finding is that they were migrating through soil into groundwater and also migrating off our bases via surface water and drainage. So we have a national environmental protection measure process that we need to comply with around doing site investigations. We quickly understood that we've got obviously a lot of bases with airfields where we have firefighting capability, and we're also doing firefighting at a range of other locations as well. On in our naval establishments, for example, where we've got fixed and wharf side firefighting engineering services. So we really had to get on the front foot to start those investigation processes, to do the risk assessments that come with those investigations around human health and ecological risk, but really engage the community. We were criticised from a couple of communities where they didn't think we responded quickly enough. They didn't trust us. They felt that we were hiding information. So we really had to take a positive approach to being open and transparent about what we were doing and implementing, you know, what is regarded as being the single largest environmental investigation program undertaken in Australia. And we needed to do that in a rapid way. So procurement was, you know, an input to that process, but it was a really critical part of it because we were buying quite a scarce resource. There weren't a lot of people that were qualified or had the appropriate skill set to analyse and to assess the impacts of PFAS contamination. So we had to put in place processes for procurement to ensure that we weren't exhausting the marketplace and ensuring that we were getting enough providers that could do it at the rate that we were wanting to do it at.
So this review's been going on since 2004. Aside from potentially taking a lot of consultants, I guess, out of the marketplace, were there any other procurement issues during this time that you had to consider?
Oh, look, there have been a lot. The investigation process is, you know, somewhat less complicated in the sense from a procurement perspective. It's more about moving quickly, securing the resource, and then starting the investigation process. Where we're at now, which is really we've completed the majority of our investigations, is to look at our remediation options. And there aren't a lot of remediation options available to us. Industry and I guess research and technology development is still occurring to be able to treat contaminated media such as water or soil at the sort of scale that we've got. So needing to balance certainly a community interest in seeing Defence respond quickly and starting to clean up against, I guess, a marketplace where there were very few options available to us. And we're still in that space where there's still only a very small number of things that we could actually do to clean up. So what approach do we need to take And it sort of comes back to the theme of risk around, we're not necessarily looking to clean up the PFAS contamination. What we're looking to do is to prevent the migration and to prevent it getting into sensitive exposure pathways, be it human health or ecological. So balancing that need to move quickly, but also to move smartly, so that we weren't buying something that once we had it in place, we realised it's perhaps not cost efficient, it's not delivering the outcome we need. So it's been a fine balancing act between being able to move at a pace that people expect us to move at, but in a way that still is appreciative of things like value for money and ensuring that we use taxpayers' money in an appropriate and effective and efficient way.
I might just pause there and just remind everybody listening in on the webinar that we have a number of questions coming in. We'll get to your questions in just a moment. But if you do have any other questions, please, now's the time. And particularly if you've got any questions specifically for Luke on PFAS and the risks around that. Aside from the overall project risks and management of the defence estate, what observations can you share about how procuring officers and delegates are managing procurement risk in your experience?
Yeah, from my experience, I think procurement risk, it's, I guess, in our system within defence, and I think this is perhaps reflective of industries more broadly, you have a procurement arm, and that's where you put your specialist procurers. And then you have the business who has a procurement need, and the two come together. Typically, I guess the business side are thinking about the business risk, the procurement side are thinking about the procurement risk. And I, without wanting to use that term too regularly, the risk is that those two things don't coalesce, and we're looking at them in stovepipes. So I guess thinking, and I think Duncan sort of referred to this, that they're now, there was a lot of risk management around occupational health and safety, but not about resident safety. And I think it's that, that user-centric sort of design approaches that we need to start taking to marry the procurement risks that we see and how they impact the business risk. And I've always, thought about risk in procurement from the point of view of we can run the best process in the world and buy the wrong thing. And that, as a procurement team, we shouldn't be happy that we've run a really good procurement process if we haven't actually ended up with what the business needs. So, I guess from how I perceive the delegates, I think we're getting much better at understanding those procurement risks and how they inform and complement business risk. And I guess we're getting less focused on process and really looking at the principles. And, our Commonwealth procurement rules in the Australian government system provide great guidance as to the sorts of things that we need to be able to demonstrate. And I think it's just ensuring that there's a balance between sort of procedural fairness and ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to respond in an open and competitive way, but still achieve the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve.
Thanks. That's really useful insights. I might ask Duncan to join us again, if possible, and we might now move to some audience questions. And the first question is for Duncan. And what is the solution to change the procurement culture in the construction industry? So what do you see as the solution to change the procurement culture?
If there was a magic wand here, Jane, I think we'd have waved it already, and everything would be fine. Culture change. If anyone's been through a culture change program in the organisations you've worked with, they take time, don't they? I mean, they take a long time to get it underway, to get the messaging right, and then start to get people advocating how things need to be done differently. I think, as I said earlier, one of the ways of changing a culture is to showcase what good looks like versus what bad looks like, and to talk about those programs that are done well, why they've been successful, and therefore what people can learn from that to then follow and do that in a certain way. So one of the ways that we're trying to do that is to promote good practice. We're working with different groups to try and get some of those examples up there. But one of the things that I'm trying to do, and it's probably quite a challenge, is to get to the other industry bodies that people turn to and listen to. So in construction, RICS is a very strong industry body. All the quantity surveyors would listen to RICS and wouldn't even know who CIPS are. So how do we get RICS also talking about the need to change procurement? And then we've got people like the CIOB, the Chartered Institute of Builders. We've got people like REBA, which is the architects' professional bodies. So trying to get all these professional bodies also talking about the need to make a change would influence people who would listen to them about why things need to be done differently. The other thing that, and I'm talking about the UK here, the other thing that I'm seeing happen a lot more is that the government is starting to take this seriously. Now, there have been construction disasters in the past, and there have been inquiries, and I'm not going to have a go at politicians, but some politicians may have said, well, actually, you know what, I'm going to get re-elected in 5 years' time, or I'm not. So is this really worth me taking on board? The fact that Grenfell Tower is still quite fresh in people's minds is keeping government focused on the fact that they need to be seen to be doing something. And there's a draft building safety bill coming through, which will change some legislation. There's the central government who have set up groups who are looking at how to promote best practice in procurement. So we've got a number of levers we're trying to pull to try and get this culture change happening and to keep reinforcing the need that needs to happen. The challenge is, I mean, Luke, you talked about sort of influencing and communication. We just got to keep talking about it. We've just got to keep using whatever avenue we've got, whether it's a webinar like this, whether it's a platform, whether it's an article in a magazine, whatever it would be. We just got to keep reinforcing the fact that this needs to change, and where we are today isn't acceptable. And as long as we keep that going, then we will start to get a culture change. But it is in this group, competence steering group I've been working on, I'm one of those who I want to change it tomorrow. I get frustrated why I can't. And there's other people around who are saying it's going to take 10 years. Now, hopefully somewhere in between those two, we'll get to a point where things do change, and they have to change. But it's just a case of continuing to sort of push that forward on that basis.
There's another question around value for money. How can we instead focus on value for money and public value when building and doing maintenance? I.e., how can we move away from the cheapest price that's in the winning tenders?
Yeah, look, you just talked about process, didn't you? You can follow the right process and get the wrong answer.
Yeah.
And I think even if I look at public sector processes and the way that they put a weighted decision-making criteria in their bid, but then they ignore it and they still just go for lowest price. So people understand the fact that it's supposed to be balanced scorecard. People understand the fact that it's supposed to be weighted decision-making, and yet they still just go for the lowest bid. So we've just got to keep promoting that good practice. One of the interesting bits of work that's taking place in the UK is there's a group been looking at procure for value, as they call it. And they were trying to come up with a way in which you could evaluate all the criteria associated with the construction and then work out which ones are the most important. So sustainability or social value or lifetime costing or whatever it would be, and allow people to have some sort of decision-making tool that would guide them to make the right decisions. The challenge with that is it became extremely complicated very, very quickly. And the danger is you come up with a great, almost like consultant-led technical solution, which no one can use. The principles of balanced decision-making we all get. I think everyone who's on this webinar would understand that. We're just going to keep banging the drum on it. And there are cases, and there still will be cases, where people have gone for lowest bid and they need to be called out on it when they've made the wrong call, when they made the bad decision. And that led to either sustainability impact, it led to a contamination problem, it led to a building falling down. They're the ones that we've actually got to really just keep coming back to and saying, that's why we need to make something different. But we in procurement know how to do this. We just got to help others to understand how to do it and to just keep reinforcing that that's how things have to be done, not whether we do it that way around.
Thanks, Duncan. The next question is actually for Luke, because it's something a little bit more government related, albeit from a private sector angle. And the comment is, government could learn a lot from some industries like oil and gas, and oil and gas companies often have their procurement professionals sitting within their business. Is that something that you've experienced? I mean, you talked a little bit about this in your comments, that the business and the procurement professionals are obviously separated. Is that something that you see across government that people are doing more often? Bringing, I guess, the two sides together?
Yeah, look, I think certainly over the last few years, within, I think there's been a push towards shared servicing, and procurement has been treated a little bit like finance and a little bit like human resource management, where you have a central body within your organisation that then goes out and works with the individual parts of the business. Within Defence, we have quite a large agency called the Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group, which work very closely with the business and are essentially procuring all of our major military capability and military equipment. So, there are certainly moves where embedding procurement within the business is happening. I think my observation, particularly in those sort of more professional services and more corporate type services, you spread your procurement resource too thinly, and they don't get the opportunity to experience different types of procurement activities. So working on a recruitment services contract is quite different to working on a equipment maintenance contract or procurement activity, for example. So there's a benefit to which, I guess, as a job family, they're able to leverage and professionalize together, but then go out and service the business. So, it is about, I guess, scale and relative volume of procurement and how you best put your resources to that. But certainly, in those things which we know are happening all of the time, and there's always going to be that need, there are procurers embedded. But where it becomes a more, we do this once every decade. So the new work that I'm going into for base services, they're likely to be sort of 10-year contracts. So the procurement activity will go for about, 2 to 3 years beforehand, maybe a year afterwards, and then we won't go back to it for another few years. I think I certainly have a passion for the contract management side of procurement, because too often I think the procurers deliver a vehicle and don't necessarily tell the users how to use the vehicle. And I think there's a need to have the business in the procurement process early, so that they can then, manage the contracts that they end up with in a way that's consistent and in the spirit of what the procurement was looking at in the first place.
And Jane, if I may just come in there, I think, Luke, you make a really good point there about construction, particularly of procurement. You put a team together, you do something, and then that team disappears. And that inherent knowledge of, so how did we do this well? What went on that was really good there, and how do we then replicate that if you're not going to do something similar for the next 5 years? And I think in construction, that is part of the challenge we've got, is that the only people who have got the experience are people who have been in the industry for 40 years and have built one 3 or 4 times in the past. They tend to be not procurement people. They tend to be the either running a big construction company or experienced quantity surveyor or consultants, and therefore they come in with this is how we do it because this is how we did it in the past. And what we don't have, we've got to build up that competence and capability of people who know how to do it well and can keep replicating it on a regular basis. But certainly on big projects, that's one of the problems we've got. I always remember for the London Olympics, great teams put together to do the London Olympics building and structure and all the rest of it. But talking to the CPO there, he built a great team, and then they just dissipated across the rest of the sector. I went back to other roles, and trying to keep that knowledge and experience of what good looks like, and then repeat that and share that, I think is one of our challenges. Yeah,
I think that's been my experience as well. That you together a procurement team to do really large scale procurement, whether it's in construction or services or anything, and then they disband and potentially go on to other procurements, and you lose that experience. And then you're left with the contract managers who sometimes don't really know how that contract's even been brought about in the first place. So I think that is a real challenge. The next question is for Luke. The level of insurance cover is one of the ways to understand how suppliers can mitigate risks. It is, however, amazing to see that many waste management suppliers don't have environmental insurance cover. Could Luke please share his experiences in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. So look, I'll come at this from an angle around insurances generally, and Jane, probably in your professional role, you'll understand sort of the types of requirements that the Commonwealth places on any contractor working with us around insurances, be it public product liability, professional indemnity, those sorts of things. You know, my experience is that insurance can often be a barrier to entry, particularly for new entrants who may not have the balance sheet strength of some of the other major corporates. And, you know, so whilst it's important that they have insurance, and it's important that we see certificates of currents and we satisfy ourselves that, you know, we have an ability to recover loss or, you know, in the event of damage arising from, be it negligence or insurable activities, that, you know, insurance really is, I guess, when we've kind of, the worst things have gone wrong in the contract. So we need to ensure that we've got those protections. But I think it sort of goes to selecting the right provider in the first place. So just because they've got the insurance doesn't mean that we're necessarily covered. And certainly my experience in some very large contracts, it's a very wicked web to try to find out how you would actually ever seek to access an insurance policy. Do you get your unlimited sort of insurance policies responding? They're all global. You know, it becomes a difficult process. So whilst it's important to ensure yourself that people are compliant with all the relevant sort of regulations and legislations, I don't think we can rely on the fact that they've got insurance to mean that, well, it doesn't matter whether they're good or bad or it's a lower price, we're covered. Because ultimately, is the client suffering the loss is, you know, there's a disappointment gap with the provider. They haven't done something that we needed them to do. So we always carry that risk, even though we could insure it.
Yeah. And I've been on the other end of that risk insurance angle as well. So in terms of, I think there's fairly stringent requirements about indemnity and warranties and all those sorts of things in the Commonwealth level. And I've got to the end of a procurement process where, you know, a supplier in a construction sense has decided that they're not going to get those insurances for, say, for the Department of Finance. But when questioned, they were quite happy to have those insurances or those warranties or indemnities in place for the Department of Defence, for example. So they ended up pulling out of a procurement process. So that's, you know, that's a real cost of business to bid for this type of work in the first place. But then to get to the end of the process, you know, be, you know, the preferred or the second preferred and then pull out, you know, is very disappointing, because it's not just a cost of business, it's also a cost to those people who put out the tenders in the first place as well.
Yep.
My next question's for Duncan. This one is around specifications. Would you think better specifications coupled with stringent permit approval would avoid this issue of, I guess, negligence in construction projects?
That's a good question, isn't it? Absolutely. I mean, clearer specifications, better oversight of what's been built, I think is a key. And if I look at the work that the Competence Steering Group has been doing, and if I look at the focus on other professions, one of the things that's come through is the fact that the adherence to specification and someone having authority to go onto a site where something's being refurbished or built and actually say that's not being done to specification, take it down and start again. That's the sort of and that's not a procurement challenge. That's much more of an industry challenge to do. How do you make sure it's done to specification and built in the way that it's supposed to be built? There is a lot to do with clear specification, the use of technology. So putting things in specifications in a place where everyone knows where they are and everyone can access them and can review them. I mean, there's a lot of changes that's still needed in that space, but absolutely, I think clarity of specification is key. And I come back to substitution of products. That specification has to actually be clear enough that it's not just a manufacturer's name on it, but it's a generic specification that a number of providers can provide, which is what we would look for, isn't it? We'd look for the ability to then say, actually, it's not just a Lafarge Holcim specification. This is something that is a good industry specification that a number of organisations can provide. One of the areas that we're focusing on is also around substitution, but also the marking up and the quality assurance of products as they come into the building sector as well. So there's a big topic there. That's probably a whole separate webinar, Jane, that we could talk about specification and quality controls. Maybe that's the next one we do.
Well, maybe we might just keep that in mind, and we might do it in a public sector flavour. Look, I'm very conscious of time. I know that we have got a couple of questions here that we haven't got to, but hopefully that's given everybody a bit of a flavour across the board. I was just wondering if Duncan and Luke had any final comments and maybe any final lessons learnt tips that you can share with our audience. So maybe Duncan first.
I think the one for me, and looking at the crisis we're in at the moment, is that the focus on risk and resilience is absolutely centred to every organisation at the moment. Whether it's in public sector or private sector, everyone's talking about risk. Everyone's talking about supply chain challenges. We, as a profession, need to take that as being the forefront of what we do and engage in that agenda and support the organisations, because that's what the leaders are looking for, and that we need to step into that space, and we need to be really good at understanding risk and then mitigating it, addressing your supply chains, looking at different ways of buying, looking at local sourcing to simplify supply chains. That's where we can really play, absolutely where every organisation is looking for at the moment. And I think that's an opportunity that comes from this crisis, and I think people should take it.
And Luke?
Yeah, so I guess along a similar theme, and I guess around that communication, really working with those that you're assisting in a procurement or who want to buy something, understanding what they need and what their end goal is. What are they trying to achieve with whatever the procurement they're doing? So it's never going to be just about engaging a supplier. It will be engaging a supplier that actually does something, and really trying to work out, what are the things that we actually value out of that supplier? If we've got a healthy marketplace, generally we'll have a range of suppliers that can do the job. It's about selecting the supplier that will do the job in a way that's aligned to our interests, and that there's a mutual interest there. So it's not about an adversarial sort of relationship. It's very much about a collaborative relationship where, we live and die by the outcomes that we achieve together, not that, as the client, we've bought it and you're responsible, that we actually work with them to help them deliver the outcome that we want.
Yeah, those are really great insights. Thanks very much. I'd really like to thank both of you, Duncan and Luke, for joining us on this webinar. You've given us lots of things to think about, from your vast experience all the way through to the future and how we get out of this COVID-19 recovery in the construction area. So thanks very much. And thanks everybody else for joining the webinar. A copy of the webinar will be available, and if we can get to any of those questions that we weren't able to answer or we feel that they weren't answered adequately during the session, we'll try and email those out to you. I'm going to hand back to Sharon, but I would really like to say stay safe and be well, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I was really looking forward to that session and it did not disappoint. So thanks, Jane, Luke and Duncan. Now, my role is to tell you what's coming up next, and we've got some great sessions coming up. The Victorian CIPS Committee is going to do something a little different. They're going to host a virtual networking event and trivia. Now, this is fantastic because you actually don't need to be in Victoria. You can join them and get on board. And it's 16th of September from 4:30 with a beverage or two. You'll have to be for everyone who's in lockdown and all of the others across the region who aren't, come and join us. That's 16th of September at 4:30 in Australia and 6:30 in New Zealand. The next event, another one not to be missed, after the successful awards, the CIPS Australasia Supply Management Awards, we're going to showcase the winners. The Best in Procurement series kicks off on the 18th of September, and that's from 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Australian Eastern Standard Time, and 2 p.m. in New Zealand. So the first one we'll be focusing on is collaborative teamwork, that category. So that's a great way to see the winning category in terms of the best, but also to see what you need to do when you apply next year. And lastly, this is another great series that has already kicked off, and we've got our next one, part 2, on the 23rd of September from 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, 2 p.m. in New Zealand. And this one is Women in Leadership series, Women in Leaders in Procurement and Supply, and the topic will be on difficult conversations. Now that is going to be a ripper. So we've got CPOs from Coca-Cola, Air New Zealand and the Australian Broadcasting Commission. So they're going to share their experiences, their techniques for navigating the challenges and those uncomfortable conversations. So please join me for that one as well. I'll be hosting that. Please visit the CIPS website and our LinkedIn page for more information. But really, I'd love you to just take some time at the end of this shortly to do the post-webinar survey. This helps us improve for future webinars, so we'd love your feedback. Until then, stay safe and we'll see you next time.